It's also a place that has too much traffic. And the traffic is not as well regulated as in Singapore. The public transportation is nowhere near as good as what you have here with the MRT. And so any of you who have been to the Valley know, if you go, you're going to probably have to have some sort of a car or motorcycle, and you're going to be stuck in traffic. It's very hard to suffer through without something going on there. In addition, though, Silicon Valley is one of the highest concentrations of entrepreneurial high-tech companies anywhere in the world. And I say one of them because increasingly places like Singapore and Beijing and Bangalore are also very large concentrations of technology companies. And so I don't want anyone here to think that I think Silicon Valley can hold its title of being a high-tech center forever, or to do it without working very hard. And the whole idea in the 21st century is actually to get a network of these kinds of digital valleys. So a network of valleys, if you will, including Singapore and other places, to accelerate the velocity of entrepreneurial ventures starting, going global, and getting commerce back and forth from different regions so that you can really benefit from the strengths and the talent in each of the regions. As Kokam had mentioned, many people consider Stanford University to be ground zero in Silicon Valley. It's largely because back in the 1930s, a young professor in electrical engineering by the name of Frederick Terman encouraged two of his students to come back to Silicon Valley from the East Coast, and he found their wives jobs so that they could support the two young men, and then the men wound up in a graduate program, and then they started a little company called Hewlett-Packard. So William Hewlett and David Packard were two young men, just like many of you here in the audience, and their spouses were young women like many of you in the audience, and without the wives, the guys couldn't have afforded to take the time off with no pay and go into that garage in Palo Alto and start what is one of the largest technology companies in the world. There have been many other examples of that sort of collaboration, and the thing that drew me to Stanford was this legacy of having professors who weren't afraid to roll up their sleeves and get their hands dirty and do real things for real businesses, and then young people who were willing to take a chance and turn down an opportunity for a stable salary and, you know, the reputation of a great company to try to do something really amazing to change the world. And I think that's really what inspires a lot of the entrepreneurs who come through to start companies so soon after college or while they're in college. But the other thing I want to stress is that NUS Enterprise is in the very epicenter of Silicon Valley as well. It's actually closer to the center because Palo Alto isn't where all of the high-tech stuff is happening. It's more down in Sunnyvale, Santa Clara, and that sort of thing. And NUS Overseas College's office in Silicon Valley is right in the heat of the action. It's in a place called Plug and Play, which is why we put Plug and Play on the label as well. I'm going to give you a quick definition of what we're calling the Circles of Influence framework. And this comes from a book that we're nearing completion of, that Professor Lena Romfeld and I have been working on, and Professor Wong has helped us a great deal over the years in this research, and he's contributed to that effort. So we think of him as the silent third author. But the basic idea is, if entrepreneurship is a little bit like a gambling game where you have to bet, so the players are people who put something at risk. Any of you might become a player in an entrepreneurial enterprise by betting your talent, your time, your money, perhaps some intellectual property, other sorts of things, and so you need players. The stakes are the things that the players bet, and the code is the special kind of local rules, if you will, of playing the game of entrepreneurship, and they change as you go from one place to another. So this very long list, and I apologize for the small size of the font and the very long list, but this is a fairly comprehensive list of the kinds of organizations in Silicon Valley that are part of the ecosystem. And as you look at this list, I want you to ask yourself, how does this compare with Singapore? There are very important organizations in Singapore that are players in the entrepreneurial process that we don't have the equivalent of in Silicon Valley. One example would be the Economic Development Board. Another would be the IDA, because when some of these government institutions decide to do something very innovative with the use of technology in society, you can wind up with funding to make things happen. It doesn't necessarily happen in Silicon Valley. By the same token, there may be some things in Silicon Valley that you don't see here in Singapore. So as you look down the list, say, well, we have venture capitalists here in Singapore, we have angel investors, we've got a great research university in NUS, the one we're in, as well as more brand name universities in Singapore than in any other city or small country or anything else in the world. That program, which began just about 11 years ago, that now has schools like Duke University, MIT, Georgia Tech, INSEAD, Wharton, University of Chicago, all these great universities, in addition to NUS, NTU, SMU, and now there'll be a fourth major university in Singapore itself. You can't go anywhere in the world and find that much high-quality education available. And the reason for doing it, of course, is try to provide the best possible education for the citizens of Singapore and also to attract people from around the world to go to school here. And once they get here and they realize what a nice place this is, they will do what the people back in California started to do when they went to Stanford. They said, hey, the weather's nice and warm, there's no snow in the winter, it's a nice place to live, I might stay here. And so all sorts of foreigners, if you will, came to go to college at University of California, Berkeley, and at Stanford and said, this is a really nice place. I think I'll stay here after I graduate. And I think that's what the government of Singapore has been doing in building this really cool educational ecosystem that you have here. So I'm going to show you how the players in Silicon Valley have changed a little bit in the last 10 years. And the model here is basically saying some of these players have a lot of influence locally. And back in 2000, the Silicon Valley VCs rarely invested in a company that was not in town. I remember one VC saying, if I can't drive, even in our traffic, within 45 minutes to get to a startup, I'm not interested. Please don't ask me to get on a plane and fly to Los Angeles or New York City, much less to fly someplace far away like Singapore or Tokyo or Israel. I'm not going to go. And so you had the venture community very tightly connected to a very small piece of geography. In those days, in 2000, the really important players that were global were the investment banks, Goldman Sachs, Morgan Stanley, and other companies such as that without them there to allow companies to go public, the VCs had no way to achieve a liquidity event. And so it was a very, very important part of the ecosystem. The NASDAQ is the exchange in the United States where most of the high-tech companies went public because it was a little easier to go public on the NASDAQ than it was on the New York Stock Exchange. Rules were a little looser, and so you could sometimes even go in the 90s without being profitable. So you had lots of things happen in the 90s on the NASDAQ. And the U.S. government was not thought of as very important at all. So you think about the contrast between that and the government of Singapore, which has offered lots of funding and encouragement for entrepreneurship in the last 12 or 15 years. And the U.S. government typically didn't. In fact, many people in Silicon Valley in 2000 were saying, just make the government stay away. We don't really want them here. We'd rather be entrepreneurs on our own.